Welcome back everyone. Today we are going to build our scrollable table and also use text boxes to show high-level numbers. So to start off today, I'd like to show you what the offset function does. So if we start typing offset, we're going to get 3 parameters, or in this case 5, but we are only going to use 3 of them. And to start the reference, we can say that we want E6. So basically the active cell where we are now. And if you go to the next parameter, we have rows. For now, let's put 0 in rows. And if you go to the next parameter, let's also put 0. And let's see what this is going to do. This is going to give us some circular references. It's okay for now. We can press OK. And let's see what we can do with this formula. So for example, if we look to the reference, is basically the active cell. So E6 is where we are now. And if we change here the rows to 1, let's see what this does to our formula. We basically go down. The result of this formula is 1 row down. If we put -1, we go up. So we can see that the offset formula, every time we change the columns reference in our formula, this is going to move or get the result from the next row depending on our requirement. So if we say we want to stay in the same position, we can say 0, but if we want to go to the next column, again, we can use negative numbers or positive numbers. So we can say, let's say 1, we go to the right, so same position or same row, and we go 1 column to the right. But now we say to the formula that we want to go 1 column to the right, and we can say also that we want to go 1 row below. So now we get diagonal bottom right. So basically this is the result we get when we put 1 and 1. Let's create our table, and we can actually, the only thing I want with this is going to be the format of a table. And you select from D4 to age 19 and you press Ctrl T to create a table. You can say that your table has headers, press OK. And you can actually change the format of a table, just go into table design and choose the right layout for you and format. So in this case, I'm going to choose this one. And because I don't want this to behave like a table in our dashboard, I can go to table design, convert to range, and this will convert, of course, our table to a range. And this is no longer a table. To help our column to become dynamic, we're going to need some help columns, and this is why I didn't use yet the column A, B, or C. So here we're going to say help column, and the next one is going to be number. Here we can make a reference to our vertical scroll and below our horizontal scroll. Once we are done with our dashboard, building our dashboard, these columns are going to be hidden. So we can go to data and group these 2 columns. And every time we press here, this is going to hide these help columns that the user doesn't need to see. You can actually already resize this, and this will look much better when the user is interacting with our dashboard. Let's come back to our help columns. Now we need to start building our scroll bars. We need to go to developer, and if you don't have this tab, you need to go to customize the ribbon. This pop-up will appear and you need to tick this developer box, press OK, and this option will appear. Now you need to go to insert and press the scroll bar option, and now you can design your own scroll bar. I want mine to start over here, and let's go until the end of our table. At the moment, if we go and click these buttons, the only thing is moving is our bar, and is not doing anything. So to keep this dynamic, this is why we build our vertical scroll. So in this case, we need to right click on the top of our scroll bar, go to format control, and this is where we are going to say to the table what it needs to do. So our current value, so here we are going to make a reference into our B2. We can actually start here saying you want to be 2, and this is going to be an absolute reference, so this is not going to move ever, and our current value is going to be 0. And if you remember how the offset formula works, if we say to the offset is 0, it stays in the same position where the active cell is. The minimum value is going to be 0 as well, because the offset function starts from 0 to x number. The maximum value here, we're going to say 4, and I'll explain this one later. The incremental change is going to be 1, so to the number we have here is going to add 1 every time we click up or down in our scroll bar. The pace change is going to be 3, and this one I'm also going to explain later. And then we can go to size and press the checkbox lock aspect ratio. Press OK, and now if we start pressing our scroll bar, we can see that our numbers is being incremented by 1. The maximum value here is 4, we cannot go any further, and start going up, our numbers is going back to the 0 position again. Now we want to do the exact same thing for our horizontal scroll bar. So again, go to Insert, Scroll Bar, and you start designing your scroll bar. And now right click on the scroll bar and go again, input the parameters that it needs. So we go to Control, and again, we need to make reference to our B3. And now let's put the values is also going to be 0. The minimum value is going to be 0, so the position of offset. The maximum value is also going to be 4. The incremental change, so every time we press our button to go to the right is going to increment by 1 our value. And pace change is also going to be 3. Press OK. Let's resize this a little bit to go to the right in our horizontal scroll bar. You can see this being incremented by 1 and the maximum value is 4. The next thing we need to do is to build a pivot table that is going to contain all the data we want to put inside of our dynamic scroll table. To do this, we know that the data in raw data tab is everything we need. And now we need to do a similar process as we done in the last video. Go to the first pivot table we built in pivot tables by supplier and copy our pivot table. Let's build a new tab, paste that pivot table in here, resize our columns. And now, because we only have 2 fields, we need to put all of them inside of our pivot table. So first one we need is going to be invoice number. So let's put that as a first reference. And we notice that this is in a weird way that we don't want. So we want this to be in a tabular format. So we can go to Design, Report Layout, Show in Tabular Form. And now what we need is to put all the other fields in our table. So let's do it. Now that we have all the fields inside of our pivot table, we want also to rename our pivot table to be easier to identify, and we can call it pivot table scroll table, and the same thing for the name of the sheet. And for now, let's also remove the grid lines just to be easier on the eyes. And let's also sort our table by the GBP value. Right click, sort largest to smallest. Sometimes this doesn't work. So in order for you to sort our table by a value, you can go to our first filter, more sort options, descending, and then we choose the right field we want to sort by. Press OK, and this will work. And now we are ready to pull this data from our dashboard in our scrollable table using the offset function. So going back to our dashboard tab, we can start with our headers. So the first 2 are going to be fixed. So back in our pivot table scroll table, I want this to be the invoice number. So let's paste that here. And the second one, I want the value of each invoice number. And we can actually just type this. So invoice value. And the following ones we can delete as well, because these 3 are going to be dynamic. Start building our scrollable table, we need to understand what the scroll bars are going to do for us. So every time I press in the horizontal scroll bar, we're going to have an incremental change in our B3 cell, and this is going to change the headers, so the position of the headers. So every time it's incremented by 1, this is going to give you the next header in our pivot table. And every time we press the vertical scroll bar, we are also going to have incremental change in our B2 cell, and this is going to change the value or the result that is going to be inside of our scrollable table and not the headers. So let's start building our first offset function. So we press equal offset, call the function by pressing tab. And so the reference is going to be a cell inside of our pivot table scroll table. So if we go to that tab and we say that the first header we want is going to be B1, we want to lock our cell, but our cell to be able to go to the right and never go down. So we press twice on the F4. Now we need to press comma and go to our next parameter. And for this, we can go to our dashboard again. We can delete this reference, we don't need it. And we say that the rows we want to change is going to be 0. So we're going to stay in the same row where our header is, and press comma again. And the columns, this is where it's going to be dynamic. And because we are going to the left to the right, we are going to use the horizontal scroll bar. So we want to make reference to the cell B3. Let's lock this cell by pressing F4. Let's close our function. It's OK. And now we have our first offset. And now let's copy this formula across our headers as formulas. We can resize our headers as well. And also let's resize our scroll bar because we locked the aspect ratio. This is never going to change unless we do it. We are going to see that our headers, depending on the number we have here, is going to go one cell to the right in our pivot scroll table. So start seeing that happening. And if we do a quick check, we have invoice description, type, and status. They need to be the same in our pivot table. So go into that tab, invoice description, type, status. The next one is going to be contact and due date extracted. So let's check that. Press again, type status, contact, and date to extract. So let's go to our first position in our scroll bar. And in a similar way, we build our headers with the offset function, and this is now dynamic. We need to build another offset function to have our data to get the right result and also be dynamic. So let's start again building our offset function. So equal offset. And now our reference again is going to be a cell inside of our pivot scroll table. So let's go to that tab. And we want this to be the first value in our pivot table. We want to lock this cell by columns. So we press 3 times in F4. And now we need to go to the next parameter by pressing comma. Now we need to define the value of the row. So let's go again to our dashboard, reference to our B2, so our vertical scroll. Every time this is incremented by 1, we're going to get the next value in our pivot table. So let's fix this value right here as absolute reference by pressing once in F4. And let's go to the next parameter and the columns. So because we are in the invoice number, we don't want our offset formula to change columns. So we press 0 or insert the number 0. Close your function and press enter. And now, as we can see, we got our first result. And if we check this in our pivot table, 36985, 36985, let's go to our next one. If we go and press our vertical scroll bar, 61352, 61352, and this is now getting dynamic. We can actually go to our first position and copy this formula down in our dataset or scrollable table, paste as formulas, format this to be in the center position. For our invoice value, you can basically copy the same formula as we have in column D. So if you go inside of this cell, copy and paste in E5, but in here we don't want the invoice number, we want the invoice value. And remember, these two are going to be fixed columns, so the scroll bar is not going to have any effect on these two. So if we see the invoice value in our pivot table, this is going to be here, and we need to know which column we need to reference. So if we count this or have Excel to give us the count of the column where these values exist. So this is going to be in column 9, but because the offset function starts in position 0, this is going to be column 8, having 0 as counting as our first column invoice number. So if we say that here, our columns is going to be a fixed number of 8, and let's format also all of these as a currency. Now we get the value or the correct value assigned to this invoice number. So let's check that. 36985 is going to be 48K, and in our pivot table we have the same number for our invoice number. Going back to our dashboard, we need to copy this cell down in our dataset or scrollable table as formulas. Let's also format this, and we are ready now to continue to build our dynamic offsets for our next headers. So let's build another offset function for these headers, and this one is going to be different from the other two we built because we're going to make use of both rows and the columns, and both of these parameters are going to be dynamic. So call the function offset. The reference is going to be the first cell of the supplier in our pivot table. So let's go there. So we have our supplier and we want to make reference to this cell right here. And we don't need to fix any columns or rows because every time we copy this cell to the next headers, this is going to the next column. So C2, D2, and so on and so on. So now we need to go to our next parameter by pressing comma. Let's go to our dashboard tab, and we want to make the reference to our vertical scroll. So every time we have an increment from our vertical scroll bar, our rows are going down or up accordingly. We need to fix this cell by pressing F4 to be in absolute reference, and going to our next parameter by pressing comma, and now we need to make a reference of B3 and also fix that one. And this is going to go to our next column every time we press our horizontal scroll bar. Close our function, copy this down as well as formulas so we don't mess with the table format. And let's do a quick check. So our first reference is going to be invoice 36985, 48K, and our supplier is Purdy. So 36985, Purdy is our supplier, and our invoice value is 48K. And going back to our dashboard, we can actually copy all of these formulas to our two headers, paste as formulas. Let's also format that, resize your column. Let's go down in our table by pressing the vertical scroll bar, and let's check the last one. So we have 54569, 2K, Johnson, 138, and in invoice description we have R&D. 54569, Johnson, 138, R&D. And now we want to see all these other headers right here. So let's go to our scrollable table in our horizontal scroll bar. Let's check that. The last value is 21st of October 2020. It's not ready for payment, and the contact is Misty Shepherd. And again, let's go to our pivot table. New, not ready for payment, Misty Shepherd, and 21st of October 2020. So we can see this is correct. And let's go to our first position in our table. If we start pressing our filters, this should be dynamic as well. Let's start pressing that, and everything that is associated with January, our pivot table is going to return that value. And also here, we need to remove the grand total. So let's go to our pivot table right here, right click, and let's remove the grand total for this. Let's go back to our dashboard, and the grand total also disappear. We can see that we have some zeros here. So this is easily fixed by going and do a quick if the result of this offset is equal to 0. In the next parameter, we want to say we don't want anything by having double quotes. Otherwise, give me the result of that formula. Call our if function, and we are going to do the same thing for all our other offsets. Now we can copy all of these formulas we change down. So let's copy as formulas. And now we can see that because we don't have anything associated with January, are basically blank. So let's play around a little bit more with our filters. So let's go to February. We have more data set. We have more data. And let's choose more than one filter to have more data. Go to our horizontal scroll bar and see how dynamic our scrollable table is. Let's also resize this a little bit. Let's unfilter, and let's also complete this dashboard with a text box to display high-level numbers. So also going to have a help column to say total inquiry, the volume of invoices or the amount, and the date or today's date. So here we can use the today's formula. This is going to give us the today's date. And next, what I want is to have the volume of invoices inside of our scrollable table. And this is going to depend when we have filters or not. This is going to be dynamic, and the same thing for the total inquiry. And this is going to be inside of text boxes. So for you to do this, you need to use the count a function, and we need to go to our pivot table scroll table, and we can count the number of cells inside this pivot table. And as soon as we click our filter, this is going to change the amount of rows we are seeing here. And we're going to see this once we finish this formula. So if you press enter, at the moment we have 19, but if we press January, we can see that it's going to be 2. And in our pivot table, we also have 2 because our slicers is filtering down the pivot table. And we can keep it like this to see the amount as well. So what we are after is the 29,983 pounds. And in a similar way with then the volume of invoices, we need to do a sum of our invoice value inside of our scrollable table. So we need to make a reference to our pivot table scroll table. So again, equal sum, and we need to go to our pivot table and sum from I2 to I20, or the total amount of rows we have in our pivot table. Let's close our function, and at the moment we have 29,933 pounds. So if we unfilter this, now we have the total number that is the same in our pivot table, 446,000, and in our dashboard 446,000. So now to start building our high-level numbers, we can go to Insert, Text Box, and we start designing text boxes right here. And the first one I want is going to be the date. So for you to put this date inside of the text box, you need to select your text box, go to the formula bar, press equal, and reference that cell. Press enter, and this will give us today's date or the value inside of this cell. You can format by selecting the text box and putting the font or the color you want. You can also justify or center your information inside of the text box. You can do the normal formatting as you do in the cells in Excel. We can also remove the border for this one, which we don't want. So the shape outline is going to be no outline, and the shape field is also going to be no field. And now we have this number that seems to be floating inside of our dashboard. Let's increase font size for this one, and I want also to make a reference to what this text box is. So we can create another one and say that this is our report date. And let's format this a little bit. And in a similar way, let's also build the other text boxes to finish our dashboard. Now we have a dashboard that is dynamic with a scrollable table with filters that is going to filter down in your scrollable table and also in your charts. And this can also be hidden. And if you start messing around a little bit with these filters, this will give us high-level numbers according to what is inside of this scrollable table, and also the associated charts that is showing us what is happening to these numbers. I hope you find this video helpful, and thanks for watching. See you in the next video.